In a forgotten corner of a town that never made the maps, there stood a weathered blue house with chipped paint and crooked shutters that never opened. It belonged to a man named Thomas. He was the kind of man people stopped greeting after the third year of silence. In his late 50s, with skin like creased parchment and hands forever stained with earth, Thomas had become less of a neighbor and more of a shadow, one that simply moved across the edge of other people's lives. By day, he tended to the wild garden that strangled his front yard. Weeds grew like veins, wrapping around the broken picket fence. Vines crawled over everything. He never trimmed them. It was as if he needed things to grow out of control. He'd kneel there in silence, pulling at the soil with bare fingers, not speaking, not reacting, just moving as though on instinct. The mailman stopped trying to make small talk years ago. The paperboy simply tossed the newspaper near the hedge and pedaled faster. They called him the ghost with boots. Every evening, just after the sky began to bruise purple and the town's street lamps flickered on like tired eyes, he would appear, always dressed in the same brown flannel shirt, the sleeves rolled up, exposing faded tattoos that time had worn thin. He never made eye contact, never waved, never answered the door. But it was what he did. After the town fell quiet that earned him his legend. At exactly 10 p.m., the porch light behind his house would blink on, and Thomas, like a clock striking midnight, would step out with a shovel slung over one shoulder. No matter the weather, rain, snow, or wind that howled like it wanted something, he went out. He would disappear behind the house, into the tree-shadowed backyard where no one could see clearly from the street. An hour later, he'd return, the shovel dirt-stained, his boots heavier than before. The children whispered about him at bus stops and under playground slides. "He's burying bones," some said. "He talks to ghosts," said others. "My cousin swears he saw him digging up something that glowed." Their stories twisted into dares. Who could sneak close enough to see what he was doing? No one ever tried. Not really. The adults weren't as imaginative. They just avoided him, gave him space, told themselves he was strange, but harmless. Maybe he was grieving. Maybe he was sick in the head. Whatever it was easier not to ask. But something changed on a Thursday in early October when Mrs. Dalloway, the retired librarian who lived 2 houses down, stepped out onto her back porch to shake out a rug and froze. The wind was still, the air cold, and drifting softly from Thomas's backyard was a faint, trembling sound. A low humming, fragile like a lullaby played through broken glass. She didn't recognize the tune. She only heard it that once. But it chilled her deeper than the autumn air could reach. The next morning she told her sister, "He's hiding something back there." And the question began to echo in the cracks of coffee shop conversations and neighborhood glances. What is he burying? The house next to Thomas's had been empty for months, its shutters closed like eyelids refusing to wake. But one crisp autumn afternoon, a beat-up red SUV rolled up the cracked driveway, its tires crunching dead leaves and old gravel. A woman stepped out first, mid-30s, sun in her eyes, her hair pulled into a messy bun that didn't try to impress. She wore a flannel too, but hers was clean, layered over a shirt that read, "You got this." She stood for a moment, surveying the house like she already had plans for its every flaw. Then came a boy, 9, maybe 10, wearing bright green sneakers and clutching a stuffed dinosaur like a totem of courage. Their names were Elena and Milo. From his kitchen window, Thomas saw them unload boxes. The boy ran up the front steps, tripped, laughed, and tried again. The woman called out something playful. Her voice was full of life, full of sound. Thomas turned away. They were the kind of people who waved at neighbors, who painted their mailboxes, who opened their curtains during the day. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the crooked trees, Thomas slipped into his nightly rhythm. At precisely 10, the back porch light snapped on. He stepped out, shovel in hand, shoulders already heavy with the ritual. What he didn't know was that someone small was still awake. Milo, wrapped in a blanket on his second-floor window seat, had spotted movement in the dark. He leaned forward, his breath fogging the glass. And when he saw Thomas walk into the yard, he didn't hide. He waved, just a small gesture, a flick of the hand, the kind of thing kids do without fear or calculation. Thomas stopped in his tracks. For a second, he simply stood there, the shovel like a second spine against his back. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. Milo beamed and disappeared behind the curtain. The next morning, Elena noticed the back fence had been repaired. A missing panel, one that had left their yard exposed, was fixed. She hadn't heard anything, hadn't asked. She didn't need to guess who had done it. Later that day, with a mix of gratitude and the kind of boldness life had taught her to keep alive, she knocked on Thomas's front door with a warm apple pie in her hands. When he opened the door, his expression was unreadable. His eyes flicked from the pie to her face and back. "Thank you," she said softly, "for the fence." He looked down at the pie. His voice was gravel, barely there. "You didn't need to." "I wanted to." He didn't invite her in, didn't say much else, but he accepted the pie. And before closing the door, he whispered, so softly it could have been the wind, "Thank you." That night, Elena stood at her upstairs window with a cup of tea and watched the man dig again. His movements were slower. He went deeper this time. The soil looked darker, wetter. His back curved like something was breaking under it. Not his bones, but something harder to fix. There was something about him that pulled at her. Not fear, not quite. Something else. Not dangerous. Just hollow. Like a man who had nothing left to lose, but was still trying to bury the proof. It started with the smallest things. A wave, a smile, a gesture so quiet it could have gone unnoticed by the rest of the world, but not by a boy like Milo. Each evening, Milo would sit at his window, wrapped in his dinosaur blanket like a little watchman. When the porch light behind Thomas's house flicked on, Milo would press his nose to the glass and raise his hand in greeting. At first, Thomas merely acknowledged him with a glance, the way a man checks to see if the world is still there. But by the end of the week, he was waving back, a slow, tired lift of the fingers, but a wave all the same. Milo smiled like it was Christmas morning. Elena noticed too. Not just the wave, but the shift. Her son, who'd once been nervous about the quiet neighbor, now spoke about him in curiosity rather than fear. "I think he's sad," Milo had said one night while brushing his teeth, "but not mean." Elena started leaving small offerings: banana muffins, cinnamon rolls, a loaf of fresh sourdough wrapped in brown parchment. She'd place them gently on Thomas's porch with a sticky note that simply said, "Made too much." She never saw him take them, but the plate was always empty by morning, and in return, small things began to change. Her front lawn, which she'd been meaning to mow but never had time for, was suddenly trimmed. Not perfectly, but neatly. The old porch light that flickered like a dying firefly now glowed steady and warm. Milo's broken bike chain was fixed and oiled, though no one had asked. There was no knock, no note, just the quiet hum of one soul trying to thank another without needing to speak. Then came the tree. Milo had climbed too high chasing a frisbee, and panic had found him halfway down. Elena was inside, vacuuming. No one heard his whimper, except Thomas. He appeared silently, like a shadow stepping into form. No questions, no scolding, just a steady voice. "Hold on." He climbed halfway up the trunk, placed one hand firmly under Milo's foot, and guided him down branch by branch until the boy was safe on the grass again. Milo blinked, breathless, then grinned. "Thanks, mister." Thomas didn't answer right away. His eyes lingered on the boy's face, that bright, fearless innocence. Something behind his own eyes shifted, like a door cracked open in a house long abandoned. He gave the smallest smile. Not forced, not broken. Real. That night, Thomas went out to the yard, shovel in hand as always. But he paused before the first dig. The wind stirred the leaves gently. The stars blinked above him like they were waiting for something. He looked up, and for the first time in years, he let himself see the night sky. Not just walk under it. He lingered there, eyes fixed on the constellations he once knew by heart. His shovel hung loosely in his grip. The hole could wait a few more minutes. Elena watched from her window, her brow furrowed, not in suspicion, but in thought, in wonder. This man who never spoke, who carried a sadness in his spine, was not empty after all. He was bruised, maybe broken, but not gone. And somehow her son had found a way to touch what no one else dared to reach. The whispers began like wind through dry grass, quiet, then constant. It started with Mrs. Dalloway again, her voice tight with concern as she spoke to the mailman who lingered too long. Then it slipped into the grocery store aisle, into church pews, across fences as autumn leaned toward winter. Why's he digging every night? There's no garden back there, just dirt. You sure it's safe? With kids on this street? He's always alone. People like that. You never know. It didn't take long before someone made the call. The police cruiser arrived just after dusk, its red and blue lights flashing against the quiet houses like warning flares. Thomas was already outside when they came, shovel in hand, dirt clinging to his jeans. He didn't run. He didn't shout. Just stood there, face blank, as if this too was something he had expected. Two officers approached him with the cautious detachment reserved for unpredictable men. "Mr. Galloway," one began, "we've had some concerns from neighbors. Just a wellness check. Mind telling us what you're doing out here?" Thomas looked past them, toward the stars, then to the ground. "Gardening?" he said simply. The officer glanced around. "Where exactly is the garden?" Thomas gestured vaguely to the earth. "Preparing the soil." The dirt was raw and overturned. Not a single seed, not a trace of life. But there was nothing illegal in digging your own yard. Nothing they could charge. So they left with polite warnings and guarded expressions, their boots carrying away more suspicion than evidence. Word spread faster than the wind that followed. Elena heard it at the school gate, from a father who leaned in too close and said, "You live right next to that guy, don't you?" And suddenly, she felt something twist in her stomach. Doubt, guilt, a creeping fear she didn't want to admit. Later that night, Milo looked up from his drawing and said, "I want to invite him for dinner. He's probably lonely." Elena hesitated. Her fingers tightened around her tea mug. She thought of the humming sound, the police lights, the hole that never seemed to stop growing. "No," she said softly, "not yet." She kissed Milo on the forehead and tucked him in, but her thoughts stayed restless. They followed her to the window, where she watched Thomas again. He was digging, harder now, his movements sharp, almost frantic, like he was trying to bury the noise in his head before it escaped. And that sound, the humming, it returned, louder this time, rising from the earth like breath through broken lungs. Not music, not words, just pain pressed into sound. Elena shivered. Thomas felt the distance. He could feel it in the way Milo no longer waved as quickly, in the silence between him and the pie lady who once smiled. So he dug, each shovelful thrown with more force, more weight. The soil caved like it was tired of being disturbed. Something was unraveling, and Elena stood in the dark, hand against the cold glass, heart torn between fear and sorrow. It came wrapped in innocence. A piece of folded notebook paper, curled at the edges, placed gently on Thomas's doorstep like an offering to a silent god. A child's drawing, scrawled in bright crayons. Two stick figures standing side by side. One tall, one small, both smiling. Above them, a sun with lashes like a flower. Below them, a green patch of grass with tiny blue lines for tears. Or maybe rain. In the corner, in shaky lettering, me and Mr. Thomas. He didn't smile. He didn't move for a long time. Just stood in the doorway, wind tugging at the paper in his hand, staring at the version of himself that someone believed could smile again. And then quietly, he folded the drawing and went inside. The next day, no one saw Thomas. No humming, no digging, no footsteps across gravel at 10 p.m. The house sat stiff and still, its windows dark, its air heavy, like a breath being held. Milo waited at the window, blanket pulled to his chin, eyes darting between the stars and the shadowed yard next door. The light never flicked on. The earth was untouched. And when midnight came and passed, he made a decision. He crept down the stairs barefoot, breath hushed, heart thrumming. He slipped out the back door like a ghost learning how to walk. The grass was cold beneath his feet. The world felt too quiet, like even the crickets had decided not to speak tonight. He crossed the small stretch between his home and Thomas's, his little flashlight clutched in one hand, the crumpled drawing in the other. But the yard was empty, no shovel, no Thomas. Only that patch of disturbed earth and silence thick enough to drown in. Then a voice cracked the night. "Milo!" Elena's voice, sharp with panic, broke through the quiet like a storm splitting a still lake. She burst out into the darkness, hair wild, barefoot, breathless, searching. When she spotted her son near the edge of the yard, her scream caught in her throat. But before she could reach him, Thomas appeared. He stepped from the shadows with a violence that didn't come from anger, but terror. His eyes were wide, not with rage, but with the kind of fear that lives deep in the bones of a man who's already lost everything once. He rushed toward Milo, grabbing the boy by the shoulders, trembling. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered, his voice hoarse, broken. "You don't know what's under the ground." Elena froze. Her breath caught. "What?" she whispered. Thomas didn't answer. His face twisted with something deeper than guilt, deeper than grief. He let go of the boy, stepped back, and slammed his door shut behind him. The porch light flicked off, the windows darkened, and the silence returned like a tide pulling everything away. The next morning the house remained sealed, curtains drawn, no movement, no sound, as though Thomas had vanished into the very ground he had been digging for so many nights. Elena sat on her porch with Milo beside her, the morning wind tugging at a torn corner of paper in his hands. It was the drawing, the one he made for Thomas, the one now split down the center, as if the smile he gave that man had cracked under the weight of something no child could understand. Something buried and still breathing. Days slipped by in a kind of gray that felt thicker than fog, the kind of stillness that wraps itself around a house until even the birds forget to sing. Thomas's porch remained untouched. No boots, no movement, no sounds. Just a house sealed like a tomb, watching the world in silence. The hole behind his house remained, a dark wound in the earth that never healed, only deepened. The dirt was uneven now, shaped by ritual, but untouched since the night he told a child to stay away. Milo no longer asked about him. He just sat quietly at his window sometimes, tracing the edge of the torn drawing with his finger, while Elena watched him and felt her own heart pull tight. On the fifth morning, Elena stepped outside holding something in her hand. Not baked goods this time, not kindness wrapped in foil. Just a letter, folded, handwritten, trembling at the edges like her heart. She didn't knock. She just placed it gently on his porch and walked away. Inside, Thomas sat in his chair, surrounded by silence. He hadn't spoken aloud in days, maybe longer. He didn't know anymore. The light in the house was dim, filtered through curtains that hadn't been opened since before the police visit. Dust floated in the air like ash. But when he saw the letter, when he opened the door just enough to pull it inside, something in him shifted. He read it by the glow of a small desk lamp, the kind that once lit bedtime stories. "You helped us more than you know. Let us help you. E." His hands trembled. The letter slipped to his lap, and in the glow of that soft yellow light, memories came like they always did. Not in order, not gently, but in fragments sharp enough to bleed. A boy, golden curls, running barefoot through the yard, chasing fireflies. A laugh that shook the trees. "Daddy, watch me!" Thomas's arms catching him, spinning him, the sun dipping behind the house as the boy fell asleep on his chest. Then, glass shattering, metal screeching, screams, a phone call, a woman's voice shrill and cracked, the world collapsing, hospital beeping like a broken lullaby, a child's toy left behind on a seat. The hole in the backyard was never for plants, never for a garden. Each night he buried pieces of the past, a toy fire truck, a crayon drawing, a letter from his wife he never answered, a photograph curled from years of being folded and unfolded. He wasn't gardening, he was grieving, and he didn't know how to stop. But Milo, that boy with the same firefly eyes, had looked at him not with pity, but hope. The drawing, the thank you, the laugh in the tree. They were not burdens. They were offerings, memories with open hands instead of clenched fists. That night, Thomas didn't carry a shovel. He walked outside with something else. A photo, creased and faded, of a boy holding a wooden airplane, cheeks lit by sunlight. He stood beside the hole. He looked at the sky, and for the first time in years, he didn't bury the memory. He pressed the photo to his chest, held it there, eyes closed, as if the heart he'd silenced was learning to beat again, not to forget, but to remember, and still live. The night was thick with the kind of stillness that feels sacred. No wind stirred the trees. No animal dared to cry out. It was the sort of silence that asked for reverence or mourning. Elena moved like a shadow, her breath caught somewhere between her ribs and her throat. She had waited until Milo was asleep, until the house grew quiet, and then slipped out. Barefoot, jacket clutched close, heart thudding like distant thunder. Something told her this night mattered, that something in the dark was about to be seen, truly seen, for the first time. She followed from a distance, careful, respectful. Thomas walked slowly, holding something in both hands. The photograph, maybe. He didn't look over his shoulder, didn't seem to know she was there. Or maybe he did. Maybe he just didn't care anymore. He passed the back edge of his house, stepping onto the grass where he'd always dug. But this time, he didn't stop at one hole. Elena froze. Her breath hitched. There weren't just one or two disturbed patches of earth. There were dozens, rows of them, neatly lined, carefully marked, each with a stone at its head, some shaped, others plain. Some carved with initials, others blank. Not a garden, not a backyard, a graveyard, a secret cemetery, hidden behind the home of the town's quietest ghost. Elena stepped closer now, no longer caring about stealth. Thomas knelt at one of the graves, hands trembling, head bowed, whispering something so faint it barely stirred the air. A lullaby, barely audible, but unmistakable now that she heard it clearly. A melody hummed, low and broken. And then, the voice cracked, just once, into something raw, a cry. Thomas's shoulders shook. Elena felt her knees buckle under the weight of it all. It wasn't madness. It was memory. It was grief so dense it turned earth into altars. She scanned the stones, some names she recognized. Children whose faces had once been taped to telephone poles, on milk cartons, whispered about in grocery stores before people forgot. One stone simply said, "No name, age 6, found in river, 1998." Another, "Still waiting, brown eyes, Star Wars shirt." Then her gaze landed on the largest stone, at the very center of the graveyard. It had one word. Benjamin. She remembered the name, the case, years ago. A little boy who vanished without a trace. Thomas's son. He had been one of them. And when the world gave up on answers, Thomas didn't. But not with anger, not with revenge, with ritual. Every night he buried something. A keepsake, a tribute, a whisper of love for a child who never got a goodbye. Not just his child, but everyone's. She stepped forward. Thomas looked up. His face was streaked with tears, hollowed by years, lit only by moonlight and memory. He didn't flinch at her presence, didn't speak, didn't have to. She knelt beside him, hands trembling, reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the crumpled, worn drawing Milo had made. She smoothed the edges gently and laid it down at the base of one of the unmarked stones. A gift, a gesture, a promise, that someone saw him, that someone remembered. Thomas stared at the paper for a long time, and then, his hands, so used to shovels and silence, rose to his face, and he wept. Not the quiet, bottled tears of a broken man, but the guttural, full-bodied weeping of a soul that had held too much for too long. And in that moment, beneath the stars, beside the dead, within the gaze of the only person who finally understood, the ghost with boots became a man again, not whole, but no longer alone. Weeks passed like slow-moving clouds, heavy but not as dark. Thomas no longer walked out at 10 p.m. with a shovel. The holes behind his house had been filled, not with dirt, but with dignity. Each mound remained untouched, marked with care, now surrounded by something new. Life, real flowers, daisies, marigolds, wild violets that Milo picked out himself from a garden book Elena brought over. They bloomed like memories unburied, quiet but defiantly alive. The backyard had transformed, not into a place of forgetting, but of honor, a sanctuary, and Milo, always grinning, always muddy-kneed, became Thomas's unlikely apprentice. The boy's laughter scattered like birdsong as he asked endless questions about how deep to plant, how much to water, whether bees liked roses. Thomas answered with few words but with patience, gentle nods, the kind of guidance only grief could teach. Elna came often now, sometimes with pie, sometimes with nothing but 2 cups of warm coffee, and a silence they both respected. They never spoke of the graveyard. They didn't need to. They had seen it together, shared its weight. And in that silence, something began to bloom between them too. A kind of quiet companionship that grew not from fixing, but from witnessing. One afternoon, under the soft haze of an early spring sky, Thomas hammered a small wooden sign into the ground just beyond the first row of stones. The letters were carved by hand, uneven but certain. Here rest those the world forgot, but not me. No speeches were made, no ceremony, just the wind, gently sifting through the trees like soft applause. And later, on certain nights when the stars came out clear and the earth felt still, a faint humming would float from the backyard, familiar but no longer heavy, not haunting, not sorrowful. Just a lullaby, one not sung from pain, but from remembrance. The kind of song a father sings when he knows his child is listening, somewhere in the quiet. The kind of sound that says, "You mattered. You still do." Thomas sat with his back against the porch, eyes closed, Milo's latest flower bed blooming by his feet. Not every loss is meant to be buried in silence, and not every hole is meant for hiding. Some holes are for healing. If this story touched your heart, comment.